Well, greetings. Thank you for being here this afternoon. My name is Adam Kronk. I'm the program director of the Notre Dame Deloitte Center for Ethical Leadership, and I've been part of the committee helping put this week together. And the theme this week is politics as public service. And today we have with us Mayor Pete Buttigieg. He is originally from the area, went to St. Joe High School, then went off to Harvard. After Harvard, he worked, let me make sure I get this in the right order. Worked in D.C. for former U.S. Defense Secretary William Cohen. Then he was awarded a Rhodes Scholarship, went and studied at Oxford. And after that, he worked for McKinsey, responsible for advising senior business and government leaders on major decisions related to economic development, energy policy, strategic business initiatives, and logistics. That work took him around the world, literally. He did some time both in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's also an officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve, and we are fortunate enough that he came back to the community and is now serving as our mayor. So I'll welcome Mayor Pete.
Thank you for the opportunity, the invitation to be here. I've been looking forward to this. And I also think that the concept of this part of the series, politics in public service, as public service, is an encouraging one, because I fear that sometimes the word politics is spoken and then the last thing on other people's minds is ethics. Unfortunately, in our time, there's a sense that politics and ethics are two fields or disciplines that are pretty estranged from each other. I just saw a poll come out recently where they were evaluating the American people's level of respect for Congress. Came in at 9%. Communism has an 11. Saddam Hussein had an 8. They did some back-to-back matchups with Congress, which are also interesting. Replacement refs beat Congress 56 to 29. Lice 67, Congress 19. Brussels sprouts easy win 69 to 23. People prefer root canals to Congress 56 to 32. Let's see. France actually beat Congress 46 to 36. Nickelback. Interesting. Did have the edge. 39 to 32, though, was a little bit closer for Nickelback. You'd be relieved to hear that Congress still came in ahead of Fidel Castro, the Ebola virus, and Lindsay Lohan. So, not the absolutely least well-regarded entity, but not very encouraging. Although, for reasons I'll go into a little bit later, I actually think one of the joys of working in state and local politics, especially local politics, is that some of the things that poison national federal politics in the United States Congress are things that we're comparatively immune to here at the local level. I should also point that this is nothing new. There's an 18th century quotation I saw not long ago from the French author Beaumarchais in The Marriage of Figaro, where a character is saying that he thinks politics is easy. I could do politics if I wanted to. He says, there's nothing to politics but this, pretending not to know what you know, pretending to know everything you don't know, pretending to hear things that you don't understand, and not to even hear the things that you do. To lock yourself up with great ceremony and then sit there sharpening pencils and looking deep. To send out spies and give pensions to traitors, intercept letters, and try to ennoble the poverty of the means by the justice of your ends. That's all there is to politics, I swear by my life. That was the 18th century. So this tension between what we think is ethical and our regard for the political seems to be something that's been around probably as long as politics itself. The tensions that emerge, I think, in politics and public service go back to the relationship that some pretty basic and deep philosophical questions have with a public life. And I want to focus on two questions in particular. The question, who am I? And the question, why am I here? But each of those questions I want to talk about in a somewhat more narrow or tactical sense than the philosophical sense. First of all, when I talk about who am I, I don't mean the deepest existential question of who am I? But I do want to talk about something that is on display for anybody in public life and also a concern, I think, for anybody really in any professional role at all, and certainly in business. And that is, who am I in the sense of in what capacity am I making this decision? Or in what capacity am I interacting with this person? Who am I to them? Who am I right now? Am I myself as a person? Am I here as a teacher, as a student, as an officer, as an official, as a leader, as a follower, as a candidate? What role is the dominant one? Because that has a lot of implications. It has implications for style, right? You may have a certain way that you interact with people generically. The average person who comes across your field of vision, you pass by them on the sidewalk, there's a certain way that you would talk to them or would want to talk to them, which might be very different from the way you would talk to somebody if, for example, you were their supervisor or their teacher. And different again from how you might talk to them or work with them if they were a peer or somebody who was appointed above you. It also has substantive consequences. The substantive decision you're going to make might be different if you're making it as an individual and just doing whatever you think makes sense in a given situation, versus if you're an individual wearing a certain hat, if you have a role, a responsibility to carry out. And often those things come into conflict. For me, the awareness of the importance of understanding who you are in the sense of what your role is happened in a really unpleasant situation. There had been a homicide in South Bend, and as I sometimes do, the next morning I went over to where it had happened. I didn't expect anybody to be there. I just wanted to get a sense. I wanted to stand on that corner to gauge what the neighborhood felt like, to see just how close it was to a nearby school, which I was concerned about. And I was just standing there, kind of inhaling the place on a Saturday morning after something terrible had happened the night before, when unexpectedly a number of members of the family of the victim showed up and began to congregate, friends, family, cousins, and parents. And I talked a little bit with the father, who was more talkative, and some of the folks from around the neighborhood. And the mother was off to the side. In fact, she couldn't really bring herself to walk, so she sat in the back seat of a car. The family drove her in, but she couldn't bring herself to walk. And I began to realize while I was talking with other people around the scene that I needed to go talk to this mother in case there was anything that I could learn or anything that I had to offer. And I wasn't sure what to do in that situation because I have no skill or competence as a grief counselor or any particular gift or awareness of what you might say to somebody who's grieving that will make them feel any better and not sound like platitude. I almost didn't go up to talk to her. I was so anxious about doing it, knowing the right thing to say. But I took a deep breath and did, and spent some time with her. And we had a conversation about growing up in South Bend, as well as what her son had been like. And I sensed that the conversation was worth something to her, that she felt better after the conversation than before. And what I realized as I walked away was that that was not because of any skill or ability or insight on my part. It was because the mayor had stopped to talk to her. It was the mayor. She would not remember anything I said. Nothing I said was particularly interesting. What she would remember was that we'd spent a little bit of time together. And any other person in that situation could have brought the same comfort just by the act of talking with her. I was not there as Pete, and it didn't matter if Pete was good or bad at having this kind of conversation. I was there as the city, and it did matter that the city cared enough to spend a little time with her, ask her about what had happened, and share those condolences. So that's maybe a bit of an extreme case, but there are cases that happen to all of us where we see some kind of tension or disconnect in answering that question, who am I, versus how you think of yourself as an individual and how you think of yourself in some relation to other people. My concept of the idea of style is this, that the ways in which you correspond or conform to everybody else in a similar role constitute your professionalism. The way that a banker is like every other banker, the way that a mayor is like pretty much any other mayor. Those amount to your professionalism. And then everything else, everything you do that's a little bit different from everybody else in that same role, everybody else with that same description applying to them. Everything different, that adds up to your style. And that's what you distinctively bring. That's not the role, that's not the profession, it's you. And that tension between professionalism and style is something that I think we feel and that piles upon itself, especially if we have multiple professions. So what makes me unusual among fellow naval officers, once word got around, unfortunately, what my day job was, is that I have a political day job. Now they call me the Honorable JG around there, with a bit of a cheerful smirk. But it's so often your professionalism in one field, or the way in which you conform to one field, will actually be the way in which you don't conform in another, and that goes into your style as well. But there are all these conflicts and all these tensions between your different roles, and often between your different values. And life brings those into confrontation with each other all the time. And how you resolve those is the stuff, I believe, of character. So what's it like dealing with this substantively in terms of political decision making? Well, again, one of the questions is, who am I, right? And one of the answers is, I am somebody who represents a number of people who elected me. Another way to answer that question is that I have been chosen as a leader. And those are very, very different, even though they're inseparable. They're very different implications, right? Because if you're representing people who elected you, that means that your job is to reflect what they think. Your job is to do what they would do if they were in your position. And the whole idea of elections is that that's where you stop and check whether that actually happened. And if it didn't, they can fire you. On the other hand, the idea of a leader is fundamentally in tension with that idea. Because by definition, you cannot lead people to where they are. Then you'd just be hanging out, not leading. The instinct of leadership is an instinct to change something. You're in some group or some environment, and you see a need for it to develop differently, and you want to apply yourself toward making that happen. And you get other people to come along with you. That's leadership. Leadership involves changing or shaping where people are. And every elected official lives this puzzle between the extent to which you want to be faithful to your existence as a representative, something which is enforced frequently by the electoral process, and the extent to which you have your own, just as what I was saying earlier about your style, you have your own mark that you want to make, also substantive. You have your own direction that you think things ought to go. And that tension is one that you need to hold in mind, I think, in any official role. It does not at all have to be elected, but being elected really brings it out. Sometimes I think about what you're supposed to do if you have a position and you think most constituents disagree with it. Just to take an example, imagine that you represent a conservative constituency and that you are against the death penalty, and that most of the people you represent favor the death penalty. You then go through a series of choices about how you're going to handle this. And in roughly increasing order of appeal, I think they're as follows. First of all, you just ignore it and hope nobody notices that you disagree with your constituents on this thing, and it never comes up. And that's one thing that often happens. And part of being good in public life, I think, is choosing which issues you're not going to get deeply involved in. Another is changing your values to conform with the values of the people you're trying to impress. And that happens a lot. And again, outside of politics, it still happens. Matter of fact, it happens all the time in socially intense environments, and it happens more than anywhere else among young people hoping to fit in with other young people. Your values themselves, you will take on the values of the organization or the society or the community that you're in. So you can change. Another thing you can do is not change, but pretend to change. Trick people. And that happens quite a bit. you have one position, but you represent yourself having another position, because if you told people what you really think, you'd never get elected. I actually suspect that's happened a lot on the death penalty for certain people. The heavier lift, but I think most of us intuitively agree the ethically more desirable thing, is to persuade, to do what you can to try to convince your constituency that your perspective is the right perspective, and hope that you can bring them along. And then there's a fifth, an interesting one that isn't talked about enough, I think, when we think about ideology and politics, which is to accept that you and the person you're trying to persuade won't agree, and to hope that you'll be able to maintain a relationship anyway. I think that happens sometimes, and it ought to happen more. One of my first jobs in politics was to follow George Bush around. Actually, I was working on the Kerry campaign in 2004. I did all kinds of research policy stuff. Part of my job was if President Bush gave a speech, I was supposed to watch it, if it was in Arizona or New Mexico. And one of his most effective lines was that he would say, whether you agree with me or not, you always know where I stand. The same cannot be said of my opponent. That was a very powerful line. The crowd always loved that. And it had some, I think one of the reasons it was very destructive is that there's a perception that was true. And the whether you agree with me or not part was really important, because issue by issue, most people never did agree with President Bush on most individual issues, if you kind of did the math. And yet they were ready to follow him and re-elected him. Largely, I think, because there was a sense that transcends any individual issue or ideological perspective, that you had a leader, somebody who was willing to stick to his guns, whatever his perspective was. By the same token, and from the other end of the political spectrum, Paul Wellstone was a senator in Minnesota, represented a pretty conservative overall electorate in the year that he was up for re-election. The people of Minnesota were definitely in favor of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. He was definitely not. And at a time when most members of Congress and the Senate, regardless of what they really thought, were certainly afraid to appear weak on national security, and therefore often either fudged or shifted to favor an invasion they would later claim to say they'd been against all along. Senator Wellstone took a very hard stand against the invasion from a state that was for the invasion in an election year, and his numbers in the polls went up. Not because he had changed a lot of minds about whether the invasion was a good idea, but because he commanded a certain level of respect that was more important to many voters than that individual issue. And we'll never know what happened because he died during that re-election, so I don't know if he would have won or not, but I think about that example a lot. This brings me to another tension in terms of who am I, you as a person and then you in your role. And that's not so much on the substantive policy side, but in terms of conduct and what you're like. We have certain ways that we would like to believe we always behave towards each other. But public life sometimes calls on you to think twice about that. Probably the best example that's in folks' minds recently is Lyndon Baines Johnson. You know, LBJ, in terms of the way he treated other people, not somebody you would generally want to imitate. He would charm, lie, threaten, bully, trick, go, whatever it took to get a senator or a member of Congress to go his way. And it was politics at its most raw and earthy, and had a lot of the attributes that I think lead people to look at members of Congress and give them an approval rating that's below that of cockroaches. But here's the thing, you have to ask yourself, if he didn't do that, would we have had civil rights when we did? Or would that have had to wait another generation? And when you look at it that way, is that not worth it from a public perspective? Suddenly the imperative to be a nice guy doesn't seem quite as important when something as meaningful and important as voting rights for Americans is on the line. And this too happens in politics all the time. I don't know that I can give you a considered, mature opinion on this because I've only been in office for about a year. One of the things I think in local politics is you can behave a little more like a normal person still do all right. And so I found in general, if you treat people the way you would if you weren't in politics, that's okay. I remember shortly after I took office, my new fire chief, I was in a meeting with him, and he got that look in his eye like he was about to bring a sensitive topic up. And it was on the subject of appointments of assistant and battalion chiefs. This will seem quaint to those of you who are not familiar with local government, but that's a mayoral appointment. So who's going to be an assistant chief or a battalion chief is technically up to the mayor. And it used to be it was completely up to the mayor. It was one of those local political patronage things. And if you were on the wrong side of the mayor, you are not going to be an assistant chief. Nowadays, I think most mayors view it the way I do, which is that your main criterion for choosing an assistant chief is, if I pick this person, will fewer people die in fires in our city than if I pick that person, right? It's not rocket science. It's hard to think of an area in city government where it is more immediately, urgently, compellingly appropriate to just go with meritocracy. But it happened to be the case that one of the people who was in line to be assistant chief had campaigned pretty actively for one of my opponents in the primary campaign. And so the chief asked, well, chief, by the way, so-and-so has been really anxious, and I'm wondering, if you have any indication whether you'd be willing to allow him to be assistant chief. And the answer was, is he good at the job? And the answer was yes. That was good. I said, good, hire him. Of course, hire him, right? But I have to admit that some part of my mind asked myself, did that diminish my effectiveness in politics? If somebody thinks I'm the kind of guy who would deny somebody an appointment to a job they deserve because they had crossed me politically, would I be more effective in the future lining up votes for something really important that I thought was really important in the city? Do you need people to believe that you're a jerk in order to get something done? I don't have an answer for you. LBJ had his answer. I have my answer for now. It's been working just fine. But it's something you got to think about. Another thing you got to think about is loyalty versus meritocracy. Right? So the other side of the coin is I've had people who I feel very personally loyal to, maybe people who helped on my campaign, but who I didn't have jobs for, that didn't fit in terms of their readiness to do the job. Loyalty is a real virtue and a value that we ought to take seriously, and it has a real meaningful moral claim on our actions. Then again, so is making sure that the people we put in jobs in an organization are going to be the best people for that job. Each of those is perfectly legitimate as a value. When they come into conflict, what you're made of is how you resolve that conflict. And so far for us, erring on the side of meritocracy has worked. But it will be interesting, since I haven't come up for re-election yet, whether there will be cases where I pay a price for that. The other thing that you need to understand when you're looking at politics wider than the local level is the decoupling of the way that we would interact as people who just know each other, which is basically what local government is like. If you're a jerk to somebody, that person has a lot of relatives and friends in the community. There's only so many votes in a re-election. So local politics reinforces, I think, interpersonal ethics as we recognize them. National politics does not. A member of Congress represents, I think, something like 700,000 people, right? So most of the people who vote in a congressional election have not met you and have no direct experience with how you treat other people. And so there are a whole different set of imperatives toward how you should treat other people, especially other elected officials, that have a bigger impact on whether you're going to succeed or not than what it would be like if those people all knew each other. Right? Probably one of the original sins of today's poisonous climate in Washington was a development which happened in the mid-1990s when it was largely driven by the arrival in 1994 of Newt Gingrich and a number of new freshmen Republicans in a Republican congressional majority, which was taking over from a House which had been in the grip of Democrats for decades. And right about that time, a lot of them had run on the idea that Congress was out of touch, and members of Congress should be in their districts more often, and shouldn't get sucked into Washington and its ways, and instead should be at home. It sounds like a very healthy thing. except it created a political pressure to only be in Washington from Tuesday to Thursday. And then you'd be at home in your district Friday through Monday, going to the chicken dinners and talking with constituents. What it meant was the members of Congress themselves were no longer part of the community. In the old way of doing things, and especially if you go back to before transportation was quite as fluid and affordable as it is now, members of Congress from either party knew each other well. Their kids went to the same schools. Their spouses participated in the same social events. They knew each other as human beings. And no matter how passionately you disagree with somebody, you treat them differently if you know them socially than if you don't know them from that. This is why, and it's too bad they didn't poll on this because I think it would have come in pretty low. But one of the, from a standpoint of civil discourse, right, one of the nastiest creations in recent years is the comment section. If you've ever gone slumming it in the comment section of a newspaper or a TV station, the stuff people say about each other, they don't even know each other, right? So they call each other these absurd names. You know, this is nasty today because there's not even a name attached to it. So if one person has no idea who the other is, it's just opinions fighting each other. And unfortunately, the atmosphere among members of Congress increasingly has more in common with the comments section at the bottom of the news story than it does with the town hall meeting, where you want to be at least a little careful how you talk about somebody because their kid might be playing softball with yours the next day. And we have to think about the consequences that that's had. One other thing on the who am I front, and then I'll move to the other question. One of the philosophical questions around identity has to do with whether we're the same people over time. When Meet the Press was hosted by Tim Russert, he had a kind of a signature move, a favorite maneuver. And almost every Sunday morning you would see him do this. What he would do is he would get a politician, usually a senator, on the show, and they'd be making the case for some presidential candidate or some policy or something. And he would pull up a clip or a quote from about 10 years earlier, but then saying something completely different. And then he'd just twist that knife and he'd say, but before you said that, now you're saying this, what's up with that? It was literally, an entire show was based on that. In some ways, The Daily Show now does this to a lot of people. And another question, without an easy or obvious answer for people in public life is, how much do you owe to your previous self? There's certainly an expectation that you can keep your promises. So if you're making a promise, that is a contract between present and future, right? That's present self committing future self to do so. On the other hand, realities change all around us all the time. And what kind of leader are you if your attitude on everything is exactly the same as it was a generation ago? What kind of critical thinking does that show? What kind of flexibility and openness to new ideas? We like to think that integrity has to do with being consistent and true to yourself over time. But which self are you being true to? And to what extent does being true to yourself over time entail believing the same thing over the years? So that's all I'll say about the question of who am I. The other question philosophers always ask is why am I here? And again, I don't want to get into why am I here in the universe. But there are a lot of moments where I'm asking myself, why am I here in this meeting? And you will too, whatever it is you do. Knowing exactly why you're doing what you're doing is very important because time, like money, is finite and must be regarded in the same way that a budget is actually a moral document. Because in the budget, when you say we're going to invest more in this than that, you're saying this is more important than that, right? For the same reason, at least for a leader, business leader, certainly a political leader, your schedule is a moral document. I spent more time on this than that. I guess that's a way of saying this deserves more attention. So are you spending more or less time on transit versus safety, on safety versus economic development, on economic development for corporations versus the way economic development is going to work for low-income communities? Saying what's more important often winds up having implications or revealing what you think about who's more. So knowing exactly why you are where you are is one of the most important things that I think any leader needs to establish. I noticed among some Rhodes Scholars an issue where some of them had probably only thought through their purposes up to the point of knowing that they wanted to become a Rhodes Scholar. But if you don't hold in mind that a Rhodes Scholarship is a very specific thing, which is funding in order to pursue a course of study at Oxford, if that part is not top of mind, then when you actually get there and you start the course of study, you may not know what to do with yourself. And some people actually went home pretty soon after they started their course of study because, well, perhaps because the experience, it turns out, was more to do with getting the opportunity than what the opportunity was actually for, which was study. You see this in politics too. I remember walking into the mayor's office January 1st, 2012, and for the first time really in any job I've had, nobody to tell you what to do. There's no owner's manual. There's that big desk, and there's snow flying around the window, and you better know what you're going to do. First thing I did was see what was up with the snowplow. Luckily that was squared away. And then it was time to get to work. But it is dangerously easy for a lot of people formulating their ambitions for the future to think about the job they would like to have without having completely thought why they would like to have that job, what they're going to use that job for. And if you think in that way, the moment you get the job is the end of your purposeful path, because that was your goal. And if having the job is your goal, the day you have it, you've met your goal, and then there's the small matter of what are you going to do with it. It is very important for people pursuing jobs that people compete for, such as political offices, that you're seeking that job in order to accomplish certain policy goals or leadership goals, and not the other way around. Otherwise, people will catch you, and you will not be sure what to do with yourself. One other question related to why am I here, and then I think I'll stop and go into questions, is the question of why is this decision on my desk and not somebody else's? And this is something that I think everybody, again, in any field in leadership needs to think about. One principle I have found very helpful is the idea that a decision should be made at the lowest level of competent authority. In other words, the deeper in the organization an issue can be resolved, the better, because those are the folks who are the closest to the issue, closest to the citizens who are affected by the issue, and probably the most knowledgeable about the issue. But in every organization, and especially in an organization populated by people who are averse to risk, there is an upward pressure on anything different. And that pressure is to escalate. And it escalates and escalates and escalates until it winds up on the senior leader's desk. The senior leader will often go back and say, well, find me some solution that takes care of this problem and all the related problems. And the answer will usually come back, well, if there was a solution like that, this wouldn't be on your desk. Often, especially in economics, the dominant concept is Pareto optimality, or efficiency, the formal technical definition of efficiency. And moving toward efficiency is the idea that you find ways to make somebody better off without making anybody else worse off. Those, in my view, are technical decisions or technical problems, which are very important, but not what political leadership is for. Political leadership is for those situations that are not win-win. If it's a win-win, it's a no-brainer. Political leadership is for win-lose situations, where in order to promote or benefit a value or a set of individuals that you would like to help, you cannot do it unless you pay a price in terms of another value or set of individuals that you would like to help. That's why we have leadership. Otherwise, all the problems in the world would just be problems that could be solved by better technical problem solving. And one of the worst sins I think a political figure can commit is to mistake a moral question for a technical question. To mistake a question where what you really have to do is negotiate between competing values for one where there is a definite right answer. If there's a right answer, and you're a senior leader in any organization, a question that has a clear right answer probably shouldn't be on your desk. So I'll leave you with that thought, and very eager to get into a conversation.
I guess
I So,
Keith Early, I'm from Greenville, South Carolina. My first question, you mentioned that political officers should have a goal to get into office rather than just the goal of getting into office. What was your goal getting into to be the mayor? What's your goal afterwards?
the overall idea was to move South Bend on a footing where the city that has forgotten how to be a city becomes a city again. And there's a lot that's behind that. It has to do with a new economic direction, so that we're not just licking our wounds after the departure of Studebaker. Have you ever heard the name Studebaker? Okay. That company's been gone for 50 years. You arrived here from South Carolina, people are still talking about it. Right? It's good to celebrate that it's part of our heritage, but there are some people who talk about it like it's coming back. It's not. So guiding this local economy is a new mentality about what our future is going to look like, is something I felt I was well positioned to do. Another thing was trying to overcome some of the fissures and factions that have beset politics around here for a long time. Completely different, by the way, from the partisan divides that they deal with in Washington. Much more to do with just groups that were taught not to like each other. Business and labor taught not to like each other. Ethnic and racial groups often taught not to like each other. And sometimes neighborhoods, which cannot possibly survive without each other. For example, let's take one example. The neighborhood on the east side, the neighborhood represented by the 4th District Council, is largely populated by members of the professional class, physicians, Notre Dame professors, attorneys, many of whom arrive in our community from somewhere else when they take their community. Almost all of those people were recruited at some point by the University of Notre Dame or the South Bend Clinic or Memorial Hospital or IU, or somebody brought them here and asked them to take a job because they were thought to be the most competitive, best person to take that job. When they arrived, what happened was probably they arrived at South Bend Airport, and then a cab or a car took them down Lincoln Way West, which is the toughest, roughest looking commercial corridor in the city, and took them to downtown or the Near East Side. So the only way that the neighborhood on the east side will be doing as well as it could be is if we fix issues on the west side to do with the road out to the airport. These neighborhoods cannot function without each other, and overcoming that was a big goal. Tougher, by the way, in practice than it is. But that's why I'm here. That's why I show up to work here today.
Robert Audi, Department of Philosophy, with a hand in business ethics. Thanks for all that. And I'm very happy to hear you're concerned about Lincoln Way. We always have to bring people in that way unless we go to great lengths to find another route. And the alternatives are so obvious. You raised a very important question when you talked about representing people. At first you suggested that one ought to do what they would do, but you also seem to admire LBJ's defending, maybe not the ways he did it, but defending very important values that are deep in many, many people, but weren't the majority values prevalent at the time. So can one, either with a constitution behind one, defend the right values even if they're unpopular? Can one, when people are talking about one thing, support something else with the idea that it serves their interests, and they don't see that right off, but they would approve, or maybe they wouldn't right away? So these are some of the difficult questions which I'm sure you've thought about, and they plague business leaders as well if they have a constituency.
They're incredibly difficult questions that don't lend themselves to computation. Right? It's clear that every political figure makes some trade-offs, either being quiet or acquiescent on certain issues in order to get along with the constituency that is needed in order to support some larger, more important issues. The best way I've found to get my arms around this problem is to know that there are some kind of fundamental issues that I will be backing. And for me, I think they have a lot to do with fairness, and they have a lot to do with connectedness to others, and they have a lot to do with openness, which all sound like things you could really be against, but they have certain consequences which will be intention of those. I stick to those, and sometimes they will lead to problems with it. But I'm more confident negotiating those problems when I'm sticking that core. Another interesting question, which I think dangles off of your question, is if you're doing something or proposing something, do you have a moral obligation to state the reasons for which you think it ought to be done? Or is it okay to talk about it mostly in terms of reasons somebody else thinks it ought to be done? Let me try to think of an example. I should have come ready. But I suppose an example might be if you're making a case for some policy and you think it's called for by somebody else's religion, right? You argue with them in terms of their religion that you don't believe in, but that you think justifies your idea. Or is that disingenuous because you don't share that religion? You don't have that reason for believing in that policy, right? Now, to be sure, public policy is about pulling together different coalitions around a single idea. So people, by their nature, will have different reasons for favoring something that you favor. Where I come down is you need to be honest about why you favor it, but you don't need to only speak about it in those terms. I'll give you, here's one.
Well, could I give you a name for what you described that I think helps? I call it leveraging, when you try to get something done for reasons that belong to somebody else. And it's unethical to make them sound like your reasons if they're not, but it's not unethical to point out that it's to someone else's advantage, or apparently so, to do a thing for those reasons. But then if you have your own reasons that are compatible with those, fine. Isn't that the kind of thing you're thinking about?
Yes, and it's an interesting metaphor, kind of a tricky one, right? Because one implication, if you think about that metaphor, is that you're basically making an investment. You're drawing down your integrity, investing it somewhere, hoping there will be a big return for something you believe in more, right? Maybe not quite as you characterize it. You can see how one can picture it that way.
Yes.
Do you make withdrawal against your bank of honesty? Put it somewhere and then hope it'll come back, and you've honestly delivered something more. One concrete example we lived through was probably the only thing I've had in my time in office that is ideologically colored, and that was the LGBT non-discrimination ordinance. So I favored it because I believe it's wrong to fire somebody because of their sexual orientation. I knew some people who were a little iffy on that rationale. Would be more interested if I said, by the way, there's a lot of data coming in that says the companies deciding whether to locate somewhere are very unimpressed by those cities if they show themselves to be behind the curve on equality in sexual orientation. So I never concealed that the former was kind of at the core of my belief, but I never hesitated to deploy the latter argument if I thought it was going to be more effective. Yes?
You had indicated that you have a responsibility to those who elected you. And the majority of people obviously did. What responsibility do you have to the people who didn't elect you?
Great question. First of all, anybody who is in the city, in my case, right, is somebody I have an obligation to. And constitutionally, they all have the same claim on the administration as each other. So, and those who voted for me once might not be the ones who vote for me next time, and vice versa, right? So, it is ethically desirable, but I also think just easier to think of your obligation as being to everybody, in the hopes that if you did a good job, most of them agree by the next time you're up. But you do owe them also the opportunity to understand why you're doing what you're doing, even if that leads them in good faith to decide to vote against you next time. Right?
That brings up another question. This is your first term as mayor. You have no baggage. You're creating baggage. You're also creating a great deal of goodwill as well. But you're creating baggage. How do you feel your next election is going to be different than your first?
I think the next election will necessarily have a message that is flavored by that record or baggage that you develop, right? So one of the things about running as a new, fresh, young candidate is your biggest message is your face, right? The young candidate is the candidate of technology, innovation, and new ideas. Even if you don't like technology, you're not good at innovation, you don't have any ideas, you would still be seen as them, right? Because your face is the story. But when you've actually done stuff for 4 years, then can you still be the change agent if you've been around for that long? I think so, because the kind of changes I'm trying to make are changes that are tough to make across one term. But obviously, it will be less about simply responding to the past and knowing that it needed to shift. And I'll need a proactive endorsement of how we're going about that change, right? Before you come into office, if somebody thinks a big change ought to be made, they'll probably vote for it. Now, in re-election, which is scary to even contemplate because I feel like I just got here. But in re-election, the challenge is, it's a greater burden because now they have a sense of exactly what kind of change you had in mind and what the costs are to that change. And you still want to think that that's the right move. So it unquestionably becomes harder, but also probably a more authentic relationship with others. Because it's one thing to see what you say you're going to do, and it's another to watch you do it and see how good you are. Right? So they have a lot more to size you up on than just what you're saying. And so I would like to think that a re-elect would be a more, in a way, a more serious conversation between leaders and voters than that first election is. And I think we saw that with the presidential election, which had a completely different feel.
Greg Huckman, Notre Dame Murphy Secret liaison. You talked about some of the tensions that exist in your office. Now that you have a year under your belt, do you find yourself playing offense or defense? In other words, you talked about doing what you do in office once you got there, that would be offense. Do you find yourself playing offense more of the time, and defense less of the time?
Right. Offense, but not by much. So yeah, it's like that first day when I walked into the office, right? And I had a list of promises I made in the campaign. And it was also snowing. So what are you going to deal with first, right? We consider it a good week if we spent more than 50% of the week dealing with the initiatives strategically we think are most important, and less than 50% of the week dealing with things that hit the inbox or come over the wire, media, or something's calling about it, that kind of crop up. That said, sometimes that's the most important thing to do, right? Especially in an emergency situation, where your most important contribution to leadership is dealing with something that may not have been on your top 100 when you came into office, but it came up, you had to deal with it, and had to do it. So I think it's still possible to have the initiative, but it's naive to think that every day you will spend most of your day on projects or pursuits of your own name. Definitely learned that the hard way. It helped me to calibrate our understanding of how long things take, and how much time we commit to things, and how hard my team can work before they break. Because another problem that senior leaders have is pretty much everything seems like a good idea to them, especially if it's their idea. And there's a great article which came out just a couple of days ago on the importance of creating, some companies are actually being encouraged to create time budgets, not just for the executive, but for everybody. So that if the executive thinks up 10 ideas, you're actually compelled to think about whether all 10 can be done realistically with the number of time that people we have, or if you got to narrow it down to about 3. We already do it with money, but we're much less sophisticated in any organization in budgeting time as we can become budgeting money.
Rod Goodchild, Marion Gratt, father ran NIPSCO 35 years, River Park, born and raised, 63. Question I have for you is that as an athlete, when you're out there and you're young and you win, there's a lot of blowback, just like you talk about a fireman. You open it up and whoosh, it gets you. And I followed when you came in, and I see Davis, White, and Dieter, and they're all Democrats. You're a Democrat. But I'm telling you, when you're out there, the other athletes, they're out there and they don't care what brand you buy, they're going to get you. And I just kind of look and see how, growing up all my life, seeing Studebaker here, seeing it gone, 63 years of what has happened to the neighborhoods. And then you look at the city today and you say, how many more vacant houses can we have and still say it's a city? You know, it's something that you can't help but to realize that it's not the engine of manufacturing and factories as it was in World War II. You come in bright, a scholar, almost like someone in the Clinton era, and everybody is waiting to see how long it takes you to fumble and to really come up with somehow change the dynamics of what got us here and to pull us into the 21st century. I'd like to hear some of your comments as to
Yeah, I think as a fellow runner, you have an appreciation for that competitive character that's in politics.
It's extremely competitive.
But another running metaphor that came to me recently is that the track is round. So you never know who is out there, and this is especially true in my relationship with legislators, with our council. You never know who's out there just clubbing you over the head for something that they think you did wrong, or at least that they see some reason to criticize you for. You never know, 6 months, 9 months, 3 years later, that they're not writing your side on something else. And that's kind of the beauty, I think, in a way, of the public life, is that, because every one of us brings a different set of values and interests and needs to the table, but every one of us has a set of values and interests and needs that will overlap, in various shifting ways with each other. That sometimes that overlap, that consensus will happen in really peculiar places. And I can tell you there have been moments where there's been a council member who, on television is calling me the most rotten thing. And the next day we're sitting together over pancakes talking about something we had in common. Now, by the same token, sometimes I'm enjoying a donut with a council member, and 2 hours later I turn on the TV and they're calling me a jerk. So it cuts both ways. But the only common thread is the debate goes. But I think that there's that benefit of being local, that you also know these folks, and you know the people they know, you know who they listen to, and they know who you're friends with, and as hot as it can be at any time, large sums of money or any kind of power is concerned, it's still usually kept to a low simmering boil compared to how it is in those levels of politics where people feel no personal obligation to each other. It's a great way to think about it. Yes?
Peter Kelly, graduate student here at Notre Dame in Peace and Conflict. I've been fortunate enough to work on several election campaigns around the world, including mayoral campaigns, Ken Livingstone in London and Australia, a Democratic presidential campaign in Nashville for Al Gore, and up to Brendan Mullen. What struck me about your, as a politician, is that I've never come across a candidate that's been to Oxford or Harvard before, which is really interesting. To what extent do you think it shaped your political views, your ideas of what the world is like, when you came from the echelons of Cambridge, Massachusetts and Oxford to the likes of Lincoln Way and South Bend? Was there a conflict from what you'd been taught, from what you'd learned, read about, or did it complement what those professors had told you about what politics is really like?
I think there's always tension between what you learn in school and what you experience in life. I felt it more the other way, to be honest. It was going to a place like Harvard as a kid from Indiana and having a girlfriend from Massachusetts who genuinely was just a very, very bright woman who struggled for months to remember whether it was Indiana or Iowa or Idaho that I was from. It was in between the two parts of the country she knew about and heard about, right? I felt more and more like I was from South Bend when I was in other places, because then you kind of consolidate your identity. And going to Oxford, I've never felt so American as when I was overseas. I certainly enjoyed kind of imbibing everything there was about the international life and experience in the UK and making friends from countries all over the world. But it also made me much more conscious of what it meant to be American and what it meant to be, in particular, an American from a small to medium-sized Midwestern post-industrial university city. But then you learn that some things are common. So Oxford, actually, like South Bend, is known all around the world for its university. But to a lot of people in Oxford, that's kind of secondary because it's an automaking town. They make Mini Coopers and they have a BMW factory. And there's a whole layer of working class English citizens who are vaguely aware of the university in the same way that the students are vaguely aware of them. And it was interesting watching how that dynamic works there and thinking about home. The other thing is that while I had the extreme good fortune to get these educational opportunities, I think that people really just want to know when you're offering yourself up as a candidate for office or proposing a policy once you're in office. People just want to know what it means for them. That's the bottom line. And if you can explain better, or if you've thought of a more helpful policy through the benefit of education, then that's great. But if you can't, they're not going to be impressed with your degrees. And if anything, it might cause them to be more skeptical. And so I felt that my education was basically a great, I don't think I'd be where I am without it. But I think that at the end of the day, what really matters to people is whether I can show them that their neighborhood, their life, their family will be better off if we do it the way that I'm proposing than any other way. And the rest of it just becomes noise.
Was there ever a disconnect between the theory that you learned and practice on Lincoln Way, on the mean streets, from the elite to the bottom?
I'll tell you the biggest difference is that in an academic space, if you can, usually everybody basically agrees on the terms of the ideas you're talking about. And as long as you can just explain what you mean clearly, people will understand and will agree. It doesn't work that way here. Whether somebody believes you is only partly dependent on whether you tell them the truth. It also has to do with whether they trust you, whether they know you, and what cost they might face from acknowledging that we have to say it right if you are right. That might be one of the biggest things I learned in my first year in office. Just because what you're saying is true doesn't mean people are going to believe you. And so the discussions that we have, the ways that we build credibility and trust on the ground, on the street, are much more about, do I know you? And do I trust you? Than in academic spaces where you sign on to an idea based on an article you've read. You have no idea whether the person who wrote it is a great person to hang out with or a real jerk. You just look at the arguments. But here you learn that things that are obvious to you are not obvious to the person sitting across from you. And sometimes no amount of explaining will do the trick. And that's when you have to ask yourself, either is there something other than the quality of my idea that's affecting their response? Or am I wrong? Maybe this is blindingly obvious to me, but it's clearly not obvious to them. So one of us is wrong, at least about the obviousness of it. And you're just in a very different space than you are at the Ivory Tower in terms of how people relate to ideas.
We have time for maybe one more question.
So it seems like nowadays we've lost, by the way, my name's Adam, I'm from Indianapolis, also in finance. It seems like in politics we've lost the ability to compromise on things. So, you talk about win-loss decisions, and I think there's an ethical responsibility. You kind of look at it from the losing party point of view. But, so you get a whole bunch of information, and I feel like sometimes we fall into relativism, which leads to stasis and just not doing anything. Or on economic issues, we kind of go into our separate camps and then don't talk about anything. And I mean, as you look back in history, there were great compromises, 150 years ago in American politics, and we just don't seem to have the ability now. So if you were working at McKinsey and you were consulting the government, how do we get back to where we actually can all get behind something, all move forward to something, instead of just having stasis?
Yeah, I think What's interesting is that in most, there have always been passionately argued, deeply different perspectives. But in most periods in our history, they haven't led to stasis. So they haven't led to gridlock. There's been some kind of gridlock. And so then the puzzle becomes, okay, what's changed that now we seem to be a gridlock instead of either one side winning or the other side winning, or there being some kind of compromise that everybody can do. And I think how we got there is a function of a lot of factors, including media, campaign finance, districts, the way districts are wrong right now, which make people more accountable, I think, often to their more extreme constituencies. And really our incentives in government are very different from the incentives that you would have, certainly in a corporate environment. So McKinsey, the nice thing about working in the business world is that there was a number on a sheet of paper. And if it went up, you're good at your job. If it went down, you're bad at your job. There was that kind of accountability. And so a lot of other issues like ego and different people's ideas eventually would melt away because everybody could basically agree on what the goal was. In politics, that's less true. That's okay. It's not a mistake or a flaw. The reason it's less true is, again, that politics is not about finding the right answer to the math problem. It's about what the good actually is, or how you negotiate among certain mutually agreed. I can only speak to what seems to work around here. And what seems to work around here is to appeal to those things that everybody, or almost everybody, can agree that they want. And try to separate people's commitment to that from whatever the other barriers. So the Democrat Republicans, there are all kinds of deep and meaningful disagreements on the ideological spectrum around economic policy. But at the local level, I have yet to meet somebody who thinks creating a good-paying job is a bad idea. And so you can usually stitch together enough people with different worldviews around individual opportunities. And then if you were right about how to get it done, you can point to the result as a reason to continue this approach. Right? If you're wrong, you'll find out. But we also, in a way, have the luxury of experimenting. So you can try things before you get around to deciding whether they're particularly Republican or Democratic idea. You just try the idea, and then somebody will come around and fit a theory to it and decide whether it performs one or another thing. In national and international politics, this gets scrambled all the time. So, for example, MoveOn.org viciously attacked David Petraeus. What's interesting about him, I think 50 or 100 years from now, people will look at the approach he brought to conflict and conclude that it was a radically progressive vision. And the reason is, his doctrine was that the job of the military on the ground in Iraq was not to kill the enemy, it was to make the population safe. Ultimately, that wasn't the central issue. I would argue that was could be regarded as a profoundly progressive thought. But because what he was doing was in the context of the Iraq War and the Iraq War as a whole, and anybody regarded as being part of the policy decision around it were blood enemies of anybody on the left, nobody would think to set up the conversation. Right? So as soon as you're in national or international discussions, it's something that's works on where people's commitments to different tribes and different ideas often overtake virtue they might see. I see it on the other side of the coin because I'm on tug of war with a lot of conservatives in the State House who, for some reason, want to take authority away from local governments. And I'm there saying, wait a minute, you're supposed to be all about local control. You're supposed to be about local government. You're conservative. Let's make a deal. And I'm still working on it, so ask me a few months. So I don't know if that's a good answer to your question. It's a tough question that nobody's really cracking, but it's a great one.
Well, please join me in thanking Mayor P for taking the time to be here.